This is the story of why one of the most disciplined and fanatical fighting forces in modern history came to hold a specific, grudging, and fearful respect for one particular branch of the American military. It is a story not of simple victory or defeat, but of a brutal education written in blood on the shores of forgotten islands, an education that would forever shape the legacy of the United States Marine Corps. As we delve deeper into this incredible story, examining the diaries and strategic assessments of the very soldiers who faced them, take a moment to subscribe so you won't miss what unfolds next. We will explore the crucible of combat that forged a reputation and the evidence left behind by an enemy who recognized they were facing something utterly different. In late 1941 and early 1942, the Empire of Japan was a seemingly unstoppable force. Its armies, hardened by years of war in China, and its navy, fresh from a stunning victory at Pearl Harbor, swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, all fell before the rising sun. The Japanese soldier, guided by the warrior code of Bushido, was considered the pinnacle of military discipline. He was trained to endure unimaginable hardship, to fight with suicidal bravery, and to consider surrender the ultimate dishonor. Their initial opponents often seemed unprepared, their resistance collapsing under the speed and ferocity of the Japanese advance. The Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo had every reason to believe their military prowess was unmatched. They had planned for a war against the industrial might of America, but they believed the American will to fight a bloody, protracted war was weak. They believed the American soldier, a product of a comfortable and individualistic society, would lack the spiritual strength and martial spirit of his Japanese counterpart. This assessment would be put to its first, and perhaps most critical test, in August of 1942. The target was a remote, jungle-choked island in the Solomon Chain, a place most of the world had never heard of, Guadalcanal. American strategic planners knew they had to halt the Japanese advance somewhere, and a newly constructed Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal posed a direct threat to the vital supply lines between the United States and Australia. The task of seizing that airfield was given to the 1st Marine Division. It was to be the first major American amphibious offensive of the war, a massive gamble with unproven troops against a battle-hardened enemy. When the Marines landed on August 7, 1942, they initially met light resistance. The Japanese construction crews on the island were taken by surprise, and the crucial airfield, which the Marines would rename Henderson Field, was captured relatively easily. The initial Japanese reaction in Tokyo was one of dismissal. They believed this was a minor raid, not a serious invasion. They dispatched a detachment of elite troops under Colonel Kiyono Ichiki, a veteran of the China campaign, with orders to swiftly annihilate the American force and retake the airfield. Ichiki's confidence was absolute. He held the Americans in contempt, famously telling his officers that they would face only a remnant of the landing force and that the enemy would flee before our bayonets. This supreme confidence was a direct product of the Japanese military's experience and doctrine. They were masters of the night attack, of infiltration, and of the decisive all-or-nothing bayonet charge, the banzai charge. This tactic had shattered the morale of their previous opponents. They expected the Marines to break and run. On the night of August 21st, along the banks of the Ilu River, which the Marines called Alligator Creek, Colonel Ichiki threw his men forward in a series of frontal assaults against the entrenched positions of the 1st Marine Regiment. What happened next was the beginning of the Japanese military's brutal re-education. The Marines did not break. Supported by well-sighted machine guns, mortars, and 37mm anti-tank guns firing canister shot, they held their ground with disciplined, methodical firepower. The banzai charge, a spiritual weapon of immense power against less prepared foes, became a suicidal act against the interlocking fields of fire laid down by the Marines. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charged into the darkness, screaming, only to be cut down in heaps. By morning, the river was choked with the bodies of nearly 800 of Japan's finest soldiers. Colonel Ichiki, in disgrace, burned his regimental colors and took his own life. The Battle of the Tenaru, as the Americans called it, was a profound shock to the Japanese. It was their first major ground defeat of the war, and it came at the hands of a force they had grossly underestimated. Captured Japanese diaries and letters from Guadalcanal began to paint a new picture of their adversary. They wrote of the Marines' marksmanship, particularly with their semi-automatic M1 Garand rifles, which provided a volume of fire far superior to the Japanese bolt-action Arisaka. They were stunned by the sheer amount of ammunition the Marines expended. One Japanese officer noted with a mix of awe and disgust that the Americans seemed to want to kill them with money, referring to the endless belts of machine gun ammunition and barrages of mortar shells. But it was more than just equipment. They noted the Marines' physical size and strength, their ability to carry heavy loads, and most importantly, their stubborn refusal to give up ground once they had taken it. The fight for Guadalcanal devolved into a brutal 6-month campaign of attrition. In the dense, disease-ridden jungle, both sides suffered terribly from malaria, dysentery, and starvation. But the Marines adapted. They learned to fight in the jungle, to set ambushes, and to counter the Japanese night infiltration tactics. The legendary Marine Raiders, specialized units trained for light infantry warfare, conducted daring operations behind enemy lines, further disrupting Japanese plans. In battles for key terrain like Edson's Ridge, later known as Bloody Ridge, Marines under Colonel Merritt, Red Mike. Edson fought off massive, determined Japanese assaults in desperate hand-to-hand combat. Again, the Japanese expected the line to break. It bent, but it never broke. For the Japanese High Command, Guadalcanal was a bleeding ulcer. They kept feeding their best troops into the meat grinder, only to see them worn down and destroyed by the island's conditions and the relentless tenacity of the Marines. When the exhausted 1st Marine Division was finally relieved, the Japanese assumed their ordeal was over. They were wrong. The U.S. Army's Americal and 25th Infantry Divisions arrived to continue the fight, but the tone had been set. The Marines had shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility on the ground. They had proven that the American fighting man was not soft, and that when properly trained, led, and supplied, he was more than a match for the soldiers of the Emperor. The Japanese had learned a new name, and with it, a new kind of fear. Kai-gun Rikusentai, the Marine Corps. The brutal lessons of Guadalcanal echoed through the headquarters of both the American and Japanese high commands. For the Americans, it was a confirmation of strategy, but also a stark warning of the immense cost of fighting this enemy. For the Japanese, It was a catalyst for a fundamental shift in defensive doctrine. The casual confidence was gone, replaced by a grim realization. They understood they could not match America's industrial might ship for ship, or plane for plane. Their only hope was to make the price of every island so horrifically high that the American public would lose the will to continue the war. They would no longer meet the Marines on the beaches with banzai charges. They would now turn the islands themselves into fortresses of death. The first test of this new doctrine came in November of 1943 in the Tarawa atoll. The specific target was the tiny, 2-mile-long, half-mile-wide island of Betio. It was, American planners believed, too small to be heavily defended. They were catastrophically wrong. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had overseen the construction of one of the most formidable defensive systems in the Pacific. He had over 4,000 elite troops, including the 3rd Special Base Force, the Japanese equivalent of Marines, dug into hundreds of reinforced concrete pillboxes, steel-doored bunkers, and interconnected trenches. An intricate web of anti-boat and anti-tank obstacles ringed the island. Shibasaki famously boasted to his men that 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. The American plan for the 2nd Marine Division was to pound the island into submission with a massive naval and aerial bombardment, then land and mop up the dazed survivors. The bombardment was indeed intense, a thunderous symphony of destruction that shook the very ocean. But when the landing craft started their run to the beach, the plan began to unravel. An unexpected neap tide meant the water over the coral reef was too shallow for the Higgins boats to pass. The Marines were forced to disembark their landing craft 500, 600, even 800 yards from the shore in chest-deep water and wade towards the beach. At that moment, Admiral Shibasaki's fortress came alive. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces that had survived the bombardment in deep bunkers opened up on the exposed Marines. The water was churned into a red foam by machine gun fire. Men were cut down by the hundreds. It was a scene of almost unimaginable carnage. Entire units were wiped out before they even set foot on the sand. The first waves were nearly annihilated. The situation was desperate. But then, the unique character of the Marine Corps came to the fore. There was no retreat. Pinned down on the beach, with the bodies of their comrades floating in the surf around them, the surviving Marines, often led by junior officers and sergeants, organized themselves into small groups and began to inch forward. They crawled. They ran from crater to crater, using any scrap of cover they could find. They were driven by a relentless institutional imperative: get off the beach and take the fight to the enemy. The new amphibious tractors, the LVTs or alligators, proved crucial, able to crawl over the reef and deliver some men directly to the shore, though many of these were also knocked out. The fighting on Betio was intimate and savage. It was a war of flamethrowers, demolition charges, and grenades thrown into the tiny firing slits of bunkers. Marines had to assault every single Japanese position, one by one, often at the cost of staggering casualties. The Japanese defenders fought with incredible bravery, refusing to surrender. When their positions were about to be overrun, they would often detonate explosives, taking their attackers with them. On the final day, the last 100 or so defenders launched a final desperate banzai charge, which was met and destroyed by Marine machine guns. In 76 horrific hours, the 2nd Marine Division had taken Tarawa. Admiral Shibasaki's fortress had fallen not in 100 years, but in just over 3 days. The cost was breathtaking. The division suffered over 3,000 casualties, with nearly 1,000 killed. But they had killed over 4,600 Japanese defenders. Almost none surrendered. For the American public, the photos from Tarawa were a profound shock, revealing the true, bloody nature of the Pacific War. But for the Japanese military, the shock was of a different kind. Their strongest fortress yet had been cracked open and annihilated. They had inflicted terrible casualties. But the Marines had not been stopped. They had absorbed a blow that would have shattered most military units, reformed under fire, and pushed on to complete their mission. The Japanese analysis concluded that the combination of marine tenacity and overwhelming material support, specifically their specialized tools for destroying fortifications like flamethrowers and explosives, was a lethal formula. The name Tarawa became a lesson in Tokyo. Even their best-prepared defenses were not enough. They would have to dig deeper, build stronger, and fight even more tenaciously. Following the brutal but successful campaigns in the Solomons and the Gilbert Islands, the American war machine in the Pacific gained a fearsome momentum. The next logical step in the island-hopping campaign was a giant leap into the Mariana Islands. This was not just another island chain. The Marianas, specifically Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, were strategic jewels. From airfields on these islands, the new long-range B-29 Superfortress bombers could finally reach the Japanese home islands, striking at the very heart of the empire's industrial and military centers. For Japan, the Marianas were the inner defensive ring. Their loss would be a catastrophic, perhaps fatal, blow to their war effort. They resolved to defend them at all costs. The invasion of Saipan in June 1944 was an operation of immense scale, involving both the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, as well as the Army's 27th Infantry Division. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, had over 30,000 troops and a new defensive strategy refined by the bloody lessons of Tarawa. He knew a simple beach defense was futile. Instead, he planned a defense in depth, using Saipan's varied and difficult terrain, the volcanic Mount Tapochau, dense sugarcane fields, and a labyrinth of caves and ravines to bleed the American forces white. He would make them pay for every yard of ground. The initial Marine landings were met with ferocious resistance. Pre-sighted Japanese artillery and mortars rained down on the beaches, turning them into a chaotic hellscape of burning vehicles and mangled bodies. But the lessons of Tarawa had been learned by the Americans as well. New waves of LVTs, many of them armored and armed with cannons, acted as amphibious tanks, pushing through the chaos and establishing a fragile beachhead. The fighting that followed was some of the most difficult of the war. The Marines found themselves in a nightmarish landscape, where a seemingly cleared area could suddenly erupt with fire from hidden caves or spider-hole fighting positions. The Japanese used the terrain brilliantly, launching counterattacks at night and infiltrating Marine lines. It was on Saipan that the psychological dimension of the war reached a new level of horror. The Japanese soldiers, convinced by propaganda that they and their families would be tortured and killed if captured by the American demons, fought with a fanatical desperation. For the Marines, This meant every cave had to be cleared with flamethrowers or explosives, as any attempt to accept a surrender could be a trick, ending with a hidden grenade. The battle became a slow, grinding process of extermination. As the American forces pushed north, relentlessly compressing the Japanese defenders into the northern tip of the island, General Saito realized the battle was lost. Facing annihilation, he ordered one final desperate act. On the morning of July 7th, he organized the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. Between 3,000 and 4,000 Japanese soldiers, many of them wounded and armed only with bayonets on sticks, or even just rocks, gathered for a final suicidal assault. They charged directly into the lines of the Army's 105th Infantry Regiment. The attack was an act of mass ritual suicide, a terrifying spectacle of human desperation. It overran the initial American lines, and the fighting dissolved into a chaotic melee of hand-to-hand combat that lasted for hours. Marine artillery units nearby fired point-blank into the charging masses. By the time it was over, the fields were littered with thousands of bodies. The Japanese force on Saipan had effectively ceased to exist as a cohesive unit. What followed was one of the great tragedies of the war. Saipan had a large civilian population, and Japanese propaganda had convinced them that surrender was a fate worse than death. As the Marines advanced, whole families, urged on by the few remaining Japanese soldiers, took their own lives, leaping from the high cliffs at the northern end of the island. Marines, many of whom broke down in tears, tried desperately to coax them down, offering food and water, but the horrific spectacle unfolded before their eyes. The fall of Saipan sent a political earthquake through Tokyo. It was an undeniable disaster. The inner defensive line had been breached. The homeland was now under direct threat. The government of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo collapsed. For the Japanese military strategists, the analysis of the battle was grim. They had inflicted nearly 14,000 casualties on the American forces, a staggering number. But the Americans had absorbed these losses and continued their relentless advance. The Marine divisions in particular had shown a terrifying operational effectiveness. Their integration of air, naval, and artillery support was seamless. Their small unit tactics for reducing fortified positions were brutally efficient, and their individual fighting spirit was, to the Japanese, incomprehensible. They did not fight for an emperor or for a divine destiny. They fought for each other, with a stubborn, professional lethality. The respect the Japanese held for the Marines was now hardening into a kind of dread. They were facing an opponent who combined the warrior discipline they prized with an industrial and logistical power that was simply overwhelming. This dread would be fully realized in the next great battles, on the volcanic soil of Iwo Jima and Peleliu. The fall of the Marianas in the summer of 1944 was a turning point. It brought the war to Japan's doorstep, but between the Marianas and the Japanese home islands lay a chain of volcanic islands, the Bonin and Volcano Islands. One of them, a tiny pork-chop-shaped piece of rock, just 8 square miles in size, was called Iwo Jima. Strategically, its value was immense. It was home to 2 Japanese airfields and a third under construction. In Japanese hands, Iwo Jima was a fighter base from which they could harass the B-29s flying from Saipan to Japan. It was also a vital early warning station, giving Tokyo hours of notice before a bombing raid arrived. In American hands, its airfields would provide a haven for crippled B-29s returning from raids, and a base for fighter escorts that could protect the bombers all the way to Tokyo and back. The island had to be taken. The man tasked with defending Iwo Jima was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. He was not a typical Japanese general. He had spent time in the United States as a military attaché, and he had no illusions about the enemy. He knew America's industrial power was boundless, and its soldiers were not the soft caricatures of Japanese propaganda. He understood that a traditional defense, fighting on the beaches, would be a futile sacrifice. He also knew he could not win. His only objective was to inflict the maximum possible number of casualties on the Americans, to make the price of Iwo Jima so ghastly that Washington would recoil from the prospect of invading Japan itself. Kuribayashi transformed Iwo Jima into the single most formidable defensive fortress in military history. He forbade the pointless banzai charges that had wasted so many lives on other islands. He ordered his 21,000 men to abandon the beaches and dig into the island itself. For months, they honeycombed the soft volcanic rock with a staggering 11 miles of interconnected tunnels. These tunnels linked over 1,500 rooms, bunkers, and command posts, creating a subterranean fortress impervious to air and naval bombardment. He built hundreds of expertly camouflaged pillboxes and blockhouses, their fields of fire interlocking perfectly to cover every possible approach. Every inch of the island, from the volcanic cone of Mount Suribachi in the south to the rocky plateau in the north, was pre-sighted for mortars and artillery. His orders to his men were simple and chilling. They were to stay in their positions, fight until the end, and each man was to kill 10 Americans before he himself was killed. On February 19, 1945, after the most intense pre-invasion bombardment of the Pacific War, the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hit the beaches. The initial landing was deceptively quiet. The shelling had stopped, and for a few minutes, the Marines moved onto the coarse, black volcanic sand with little opposition. But the sand was a trap. It was soft and loose, making it impossible to dig foxholes and bogging down vehicles. Then, as the beaches became clogged with men and machines, Kuribayashi sprung his trap. From thousands of hidden positions, his artillery, mortars, and machine guns opened up in a coordinated storm of fire. The beaches of Iwo Jima became a slaughterhouse. The fighting was a nightmare, unlike any other. The Marines were fighting an enemy they could not see. They would advance a few yards, only to be cut down by fire from a hidden pillbox they had just passed. The only way to advance was the corkscrew and blowtorch method. One team of Marines would pin down a bunker with machine gun fire, while another crawled forward with demolitions or a flamethrower to destroy it from the side or rear. Every bunker, every cave, every spider hole had to be assaulted and cleared, one by one. Progress was measured in feet, not miles. The battle for Mount Suribachi raged for 4 days. It was a vertical fight, up a treacherous slope against a determined, dug-in enemy. Its capture, and the subsequent flag-raising on its summit, an event that would become one of the most iconic images of the war, was a huge morale boost. But it was only the beginning. The main Japanese defenses were in the north, in a hellish landscape of shattered rock and ravines that the Marines grimly named the Meat Grinder. Here, in places like Hill 382, the Amphitheater, and Turkey Knob, The fighting reached a crescendo of savagery. Marine casualties were catastrophic. Companies were reduced to the size of platoons. Platoons were reduced to a handful of men. Yet they never stopped advancing. Japanese soldiers who were captured or whose diaries were recovered spoke of the Marines with a kind of terrified awe. They called them devils, soldiers who were seemingly immune to fear and who fought with a relentless mechanical efficiency. One Japanese officer's report stated, "The fighting spirit of the U.S. Marines is high. They are not afraid of our shells. Their advance, though slow, is steady and is carried out with the support of aircraft and tanks. It is a mistake to think of them as depending only on material superiority." They were particularly terrified of the Marine flamethrowers, which could instantly turn a fortified bunker into an incinerator. For 36 days, the battle for Iwo Jima raged. General Kurabayashi remained in his underground command post, expertly directing his forces and making the Marines pay for every inch of volcanic ash. In late March, with his forces shattered and his command collapsing, he is believed to have led a final, small-scale attack himself, dying in combat alongside his men. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, over 20,000 were killed. Only a few hundred were taken prisoner, most of them wounded or unconscious. The cost to the Marines was equally staggering. They suffered nearly 27,000 casualties, including almost 7,000 killed in action. It was the only battle in the Pacific War where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than for any other single battle in American history. Iwo Jima was the ultimate expression of the Pacific War. It was the perfection of Japanese defensive strategy, meeting the absolute peak of Marine amphibious assault capability. The Japanese had confirmed that the Marines were their most formidable foe, a force that would absorb any number of casualties, employ any weapon, and endure any hardship to achieve its objective. The island was taken, and its airfields would go on to save the lives of over 24,000 American airmen in crippled B-29s. But the price paid in Marine blood left an indelible scar and served as a horrifying preview of what an invasion of Japan itself would look like. The final major battle of the Pacific War was to be the largest and deadliest of all, the invasion of Okinawa in April 1945. Codenamed Operation Iceberg, it was an immense undertaking, involving over 180,000 American troops from both the U.S. Army and the Marine Corps. Okinawa was a different kind of target. It was a large, populated island considered part of the Japanese homeland itself. Its capture would provide the final staging area for the planned invasion of Japan. For the Japanese, the defense of Okinawa was a holy crusade. The last stand before the sacred soil of the home islands. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, had learned every lesson from the preceding 3 years of war. Like Kuribayashi on Iwo Jima, he knew he could not defeat the American Armada. His strategy was one of pure attrition, designed to bleed the American forces so badly that they would abandon any thought of invasion. He conceded the northern part of the island and the initial landings, concentrating his 110,000 men in the rugged, hilly terrain of the south. There, he constructed a series of complex, interlocking defensive lines anchored on ancient castles and ridges, most notably the formidable Shuri Line. It was a defense in-depth masterpiece, a network of caves, tunnels, and thousands of mutually supporting pillboxes and machine gun nests. When the 3rd Amphibious Corps, comprised of the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, pivoted south to assault these lines, they entered a meat grinder that made previous battles pale in comparison. The fighting was characterized by a term that came to define the battle: the Typhoon of Steel. This referred to the sheer, unbelievable volume of firepower unleashed by both sides. American naval guns, some firing shells the size of small cars, pounded the Japanese lines. Hundreds of aircraft dropped bombs and napalm. Tanks and artillery fired non-stop. But the Japanese were dug in so deeply that they could often survive this onslaught, emerging from their caves at night to repair positions and counterattack. The Marines were tasked with breaking the western anchor of the Shuri Line, a series of fortified hills that became infamous in the annals of the Corps: Sugarloaf Hill, Half Moon Hill, and the Horseshoe. The battle for Sugarloaf Hill became a legend of Marine tenacity and sacrifice. It was a small, unassuming mound of earth, only about 50 feet high. But it was the key to the surrounding Japanese defenses. It was honeycombed with tunnels and mutually supporting machine gun and mortar positions. For 10 brutal days, Marines from the 6th Division assaulted the hill. They would take the crest during the day, only to be driven off by suicidal counterattacks and devastating mortar fire from reverse slopes at night. Control of the hill changed hands more than a dozen times. It was a battle of grenades and bayonets in muddy, blood-soaked shell craters. Entire companies were effectively destroyed taking the hill, only to have their replacements be destroyed holding it. Japanese accounts from Okinawa describe a sense of fatalism and a final, grim determination. They knew this was the end, but they also documented the sheer, relentless pressure of the Marine assault. They noted that unlike in earlier battles, the Marines now had an abundance of armored support, including Sherman tanks equipped with powerful flamethrowers that could spew fire deep into cave openings. The coordination between Marine infantry, tanks, artillery, and air power was now a perfectly tuned instrument of destruction. The Japanese fought with desperate courage, but they were being systematically, inexorably ground to pieces. The 82-day battle for Okinawa was a horrific climax to the island-hopping campaign. The Shuri Line was eventually broken, but only after weeks of brutal, close-quarters combat in torrential rains that turned the battlefield into a sea of mud. General Ushijima and his staff committed ritual suicide in their command cave as the last pockets of resistance were wiped out. The battle resulted in over 110,000 Japanese military deaths and an appalling civilian toll, with estimates running as high as 150,000 Okinawan civilians killed, caught in the crossfire, or forced into suicide by the Japanese military. American casualties were the highest of the Pacific War, with over 49,000, including more than 12,000 killed. The Navy suffered immensely from kamikaze attacks, with 36 ships sunk and hundreds damaged. Okinawa was the final bloody piece of evidence presented to the Japanese High Command. They had thrown their best troops, their most refined defensive tactics, and the full weight of their kamikaze air corps against the invasion force. They had inflicted almost 50,000 casualties. And still, they had lost. The Marines and the Army had not been stopped. The island had fallen. the analysis in Tokyo was stark. If this was the price for Okinawa, the price for the home islands of Kyushu and Honshu would be the utter annihilation of the Japanese people. The experience of facing the U.S. Marines, from the first shocking encounters at Guadalcanal to the final, grinding agony of Okinawa, contributed significantly to this grim calculus. They were an enemy who could not be bluffed, could not be intimidated by suicidal tactics, and who would pay any price in blood to achieve their objective. They were the tip of a very long and very sharp American spear. In the final analysis, why did the Japanese armed forces, an organization steeped in its own fierce warrior traditions, develop such a profound and specific respect for the United States Marine Corps? The answer is not a single point, but a combination of factors they witnessed firsthand on the battlefield. Factors that systematically dismantled their own military ethos and expectations. First was the doctrine and training. The Marine Corps was America's specialized amphibious assault force. This was their singular purpose. They trained endlessly for the most difficult and chaotic of all military operations, a landing on a hostile shore under fire. This rigorous, often brutal training instilled an incredible level of initiative in their small unit leaders, the corporals and sergeants. Japanese officers, accustomed to a rigid command structure, were repeatedly astonished to see leaderless groups of Marines continue the attack, organizing on the fly to complete their mission. This bottom-up leadership made them incredibly resilient in the face of the chaos that defined island warfare. Second was their mastery of combined arms. The Marines did not fight alone. They were the focal point of a symphony of destruction. A Marine platoon pinned down by a bunker could, in minutes, call upon naval gunfire from a destroyer offshore, an airstrike from a carrier-based dive bomber, and a barrage from their own divisional artillery. This seamless integration of sea, air, and land power was something the Japanese could never hope to match. They were fighting a multi-dimensional enemy, and the Marine on the ground was simply the final, lethal element of that system. Third, and perhaps most crucially from the Japanese perspective, was the combination of American industrial might with an unexpected ferocity. The Japanese went to war believing they had a monopoly on fighting spirit, the Yamato Damashi. They expected the Americans to be soft, to be reliant only on their machines. What they found in the Marines was a terrifying hybrid. This enemy had all the machines, the best rifles, endless ammunition, tanks, flamethrowers, and massive logistical support, but they also fought with a personal, savage bravery that the Japanese respected and feared. The Marine would use a flamethrower to clear a bunker, but he would also charge it with a bayonet if he had to. This combination shattered the central premise of Japan's war strategy, that their spiritual superiority could overcome America's material superiority. Finally, there was the psychological factor of their relentlessness. Once the Marines were ashore, they had a motto: "We're not retreating, we're just attacking in a different direction." They simply did not give up ground. They would absorb casualties that would have broken other armies and continue to press the attack. To the Japanese, whose doctrine often involved absorbing an initial blow and then shattering the enemy with a decisive counterattack, this was maddening. The Marines were an anvil, an immovable object that could not be broken, that just kept grinding forward, yard by bloody yard. This reputation grew with each battle, so that by the time of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, a Marine landing was synonymous with a fight to the absolute finish. with no quarter asked and none given. The diaries of Japanese soldiers are filled with this grim acceptance. When the Marines came, it meant the end had come. It was this total package, specialized training, combined arms, industrial power fused with individual ferocity, and an unbreakable will, that earned the United States Marine Corps the grudging, fearful respect of its most determined enemy. The story of this mutual, brutal education across the Pacific is a testament to the extremes of human conflict. It is a story of courage, desperation, and immense sacrifice on both sides. The black sands of Iwo Jima and the muddy slopes of Okinawa are silent now, but they bear witness to a time when two of the world's finest fighting forces clashed, and in doing so, forged a legacy in fire that would never be forgotten. For more deep dives into the critical moments and untold stories of military history, make sure you are subscribed to our channel. Thank you for watching.